In this lecture, we're going to focus on animals. This is a group of organisms that you're probably most familiar with since you are an animal. So what exactly is an animal? Let's take a look. This is kingdom Animalia. Now, kingdom Animalia, kingdom represents a large group of organisms that all share a common ancestor. Um, the kingdom is one step below domain. Animals are in domain eukarya, which means that we have eukaryotic cells. Um, That will make more sense when you take a look at the classification lecture as well as the cells lecture. So what are some characteristics of kingdom Animalia? Everything that's in kingdom Animalia is heterotrophic. Heterotrophic means that it has to take in nutrients. So everything in kingdom Animalia has to take in nutrients. It can't photosynthesize. It can't create its own nutrients. It has to take them in. That doesn't necessarily mean it must have a mouth and eat, although most do. But there are some that can absorb nutrients directly through their skin. For instance, the tapeworm. Everything that's in kingdom Animalia is multicellular. Now, what does that mean? That means that you've got more than one type of cell, and those types of cells are all working together in order to collectively be whatever this animal is. Right now, you've got about 300 trillion or so cells that are collectively being you for a while. Excuse me. Um, Eukaryotic. All animal cells are eukaryotic. That means that every animal cell contains nucleus that contains all of the genetic material for that particular cell. Now, well, when all cells in an animal have the same genetics, there are some exceptions to that. For instance, mature red blood cells in mammals do not contain a nucleus. That doesn't mean that they're not eukaryotic. It just means that they've lost their nucleus. They don't reproduce in the same way that other cells do. But all animals are heterotrophic, multicellular eukaryotes. That's the very definition of animal. Most animals are motile, meaning that they can move. This is obviously an advantage considering the fact that we have to take in nutrients. So oftentimes that's because the animals have to move in order to gather food in order to take it in. There are some animals though that are sessile, which means that they cannot move. Things like coral, things like tunicates, or sponges. All of those things are sessile as adults. Well, what do they have in common? Everything that I just named are all marine organisms, meaning that they live in the water. Living in the water means that as the water moves across their bodies, they're still going to be filtering out the food. So they still have to take in food. But it works for them to be sessile, not moving. But most animals move. Most animals reproduce sexually. Now, what does that mean? That means that it requires the genetics from two separate individuals in order to produce an offspring. That every time an offspring occurs, that offspring has the genetics of two separate individuals. Notice that I'm not saying male and female here, and that's because there are many animals that are actually hermaphroditic, meaning that they have both male and female reproductive organs. For instance, earthworms. When earthworms mate and reproduce, two earthworms come together. They each fertilize the other's eggs, and they come away and they lay eggs, and those eggs hatch, and all of those resulting offspring for both of the two organisms contains genetics from two separate organisms. So, reproducing sexually simply means that the offspring has genetics from two different individuals. There are some that can produce asexually, which means that the offspring only has the genetics of the parent, of the one parent. For instance, sponges. Sponges can break apart and each one grows into a new sponge, but all the resulting sponges are genetically identical to the initial sponge. Sea stars can do this as well, and there are some worms that can do this. But that means that the offspring are genetically identical to the parent, and it only took one parent in order to do that. There are two groups. Typically, animals are separated into two groups: invertebrates and vertebrates. This is not a taxonomic thing. because there are many groups of invertebrates. Many, as we'll see in just a moment, there are many phyla of invertebrates, but there's only one phylum that contains vertebrated animals, things with a backbone. And so we don't usually look at these two terms. This just means with a backbone or without. So it's not really a taxonomic thing. So, invertebrates. And this is what I said, there's only one phylum that contains vertebrates, but there are many phyla that contain invertebrates. So, phylum, if you follow along, we had domain Eukarya, kingdom Animalia. Below that is phylum. There are many phyla of invertebrates, where there's only one phylum that contains vertebrated animals. And here are some of the common phyla. There are 9 major phyla of invertebrates. I'm going to talk to you about 8 of them. Phylum Porifera. Porifera are the simplest of all animals. These are sponges. They only contain 2 layers of cells, and that form a tube-like body. They have lots of pores, hence the name Porifera. They're actually filter feeding. They're pulling water into their bodies. They're filtering out the nutrients, and then the water comes back out. So these are sponges. And if you will reference the non-recorded slide deck for this particular lecture, you can take a look at the link here and see additional information about sponges, as well as images. And so I've got some images here, and you can look at this, and the first thing that most people think is that an animal? Yes, it's an animal. It's barely an animal, but it's an animal. It doesn't have a lot of cell differentiation here. There are not lots of different types of cells here. You have basically 2 different types of cells, and that's about it. But they are heterotrophic. They are eukaryotic. They do not have a cell wall. They fit all of the parts of the definition that make something an animal. Therefore, it's an animal. But it is the simplest of all animals. Most sponges are marine, although there are some freshwater species. Phylum Cnidaria. You're probably familiar with phylum Cnidaria. These are things like jellyfish, corals, hydras, that sort of thing. They're very simple. They have hollow bodies with 2 cell layers, again. They have an opening only at one end. We say that means it has an incomplete digestive system. They take in nutrients through that opening. It's called a gastrovascular cavity. Things are digested, and then whatever is not digested is just expelled out of the organism's body through the same opening. They do have stinging cells. Those stinging cells are called nematocysts. The animal does not have a brain. It cannot chase you down. It does not have to be alive in order to sting you with its stinging cells. As long as it is wet, the tentacles with the stinging cells can sting you. There are several classes, and that would be domain, kingdom, phylum, class. So within every phylum, there are multiple classes. So there are multiple classes of Cnidarium. We have Hydrozoa, which are Hydra and Portuguese man of war. If you've ever been walking along the beach in Florida and you see what looks like a blue balloon with tentacles hanging from it washed up on shore, that's called a blue bottle, and it's a type of Portuguese man of war. Don't touch it. The balloon on top, the sail, can't hurt you, but the tentacles definitely can. This is actually a colony of hydroids. It's not a single organism. Class Scyphozoa, which are jellyfish. Anthozoa, which are sea anemones and coral. And again, I've got a link here for more information, and you can follow that in the non-recorded slide deck here. But here are some images. Here we have a typical jellyfish. All of the nematocysts are found here. The gastrovascular cavity would be right here in the center. These are corals, staghorn and elkhorn coral. This is an upside-down Keys jellyfish. Which is really cool if you ever have an opportunity to snorkel anywhere in the Upper Keys. You can see these jellyfish all over the place. Florida Keys, that is. And then you've got hydras here, and of course sea anemones. Phylum Platyhelminthes. This is the first of 3 groups of worm. Platyhelminthes are unsegmented. They are flat. Unsegmented means that they don't have segments in their bodies, and then flat means that they don't actually even have a body cavity. But they have three layers of cells, which makes them a little bit more advanced than the Cnidaria. They have a very basic nervous system and a very basic digestive system. It's an incomplete digestive system as well. It only has one opening. So they take in nutrients and then they expel everything from that same opening. They are what are referred to as bilaterally symmetric. You are bilaterally symmetric. Bilaterally symmetric means that there's only one way that something can be cut in half and have equal parts. There is only one way that we can be cut in half, straight down the middle. Everything that I have on the right hand side, I also have on the left hand side. We have, two eyes, two nostrils, even with your teeth, all the same teeth you have on one side, you have on the other. You have two ears, two arms, two legs, etc. To lateral, side to side, symmetric. So these are bilaterally symmetric. Some flatworms are parasites. Think tapeworms. There are also planaria and flukes, which are not parasitic. And again, here's a link that will take you to additional pictures. And I've got some images here. So we have a typical flatworm on the left, and then this is a tapeworm on the right. Nematoda. These are roundworms. They're unsegmented, but this is the first time we see a complete digestive system. They actually have an opening on both ends of their body. So it has a complete digestive system. It's very well defined. They are bilaterally symmetric, just like the flatworms. Some are parasitic. In fact, an awful lot of nematodes are parasitic. When you ever talk about this, a cat or a dog having heartworms or worms in their intestines or whatever, these are parasitic roundworms. Roundworms, hookworms, pinworms. Again, here's a link for pictures and additional information, and here are some images. Now, one thing that's really interesting with roundworms is that most roundworms are sexually dimorphic, meaning that one, they have two separate sexes, and you can tell them apart by looking, which means that typically the female is far larger than the male in these worms. Annelids. This is the group of worms that you're probably most familiar with. Okay, things like earthworms. These are our segmented roundworms. They have segments. Their bodies are segmented. They have a very well-defined nervous system and digestive system. It is complete. They have an opening on both ends. They are bilaterally symmetric. And these are things like earthworms and leeches. Okay, here once again, here's a link. Here you go. Here's an earthworm. If you've ever done any fishing, then you're familiar with this guy. Here's another picture of an earthworm. They often come up out of the ground after a rain. Here's a leech. This is a marine annelid. Most marine annelids are highly predaceous, meaning that they will actually prey on small fish and things like that. So those are our three groups of worms. Now let's move over to something called Echinodermata. Echinodermata. Echinoderms, this group of organisms are mostly marine. They have an internal skeleton. Now, when we say an internal skeleton, it's not the same as the internal skeleton the way that you have a calcified skeleton and whatnot like that. It's actually pretty much on the outside of their body, but they do have a skin that covers it. It's not like with an insect where they have the shell, but they have this skeleton that is covered by a skin. In fact, the name itself, Echinodermata, means spiny skin. So they've got this skeleton that's covered with skin, and a lot of them have spines. They have what is referred to as pentaradial symmetry, or simply radial symmetry. They don't have, they have a top and a bottom, but no front and back. Things like starfish or sea stars, brittle stars, sand dollars, and sea urchins. Bet you didn't know that sand dollar that you picked up at the beach was actually an animal. It is. If you pick up a sand dollar and it's green or brown, and you can see and you turn it over and you look in it and you can actually see the little feet moving on the bottom, put it back. It's alive. Only pick up sand dollars if they're white, and whatnot. Sea cucumbers, and again, here's some pictures. Here's this. You've got brittle stars, sea urchins, um, sea cucumbers. This is a basket star, and this is a typical sea star right here. Mollusca. Mollusks are one of my favorite group of animals here. Oftentimes because we eat them. These are things like snails or oysters or clams or scallops. So they have a soft body. They have an exterior shell that's made of calcium carbonate. Okay, some of them like squid and octopus have lost or either brought their shell inside. A squid has what's very small bit of a shell that's left called a pin, whereas octopus don't have a shell at all. They have a very well developed nervous system, digestive system, and circulatory system. They are bilaterally symmetric. Things like snails, oysters, clams, and mussels, squid, octopus. And yet again, I've given you a link here so that you can see them. And what I've given you here, we've got snails. Those are gastropods. An octopus, cephalopod. Okay, this is a chambered nautilus. Okay, this is called a chitin. Here's a typical clam or mussel. And then our octopus, I've got 3 images of octopus down here. And with that, I'm going to bring this particular part. This is actually a longer lecture. So I'm going to bring this first part to a close right here before we start Arthropoda. And so we'll start part 2 with Arthropoda.